With death-defying stunts and relentless bloodshed, Japan's frontier martial arts wrestling burst into life in 1989, led by revolutionary pioneer Atsushi Onita.
Onita and his promotion, they were pioneers. In late 1980s, the WWE was very homogenized. WCW could get a little wild, but FMW took it to a whole different level.
You get Onita will bleed to death. Every night he bleeds to death.
Other wrestler have more good move or a nice body or something, but Onita something inside, like a fighting spirit.
By putting himself and his roster of wrestlers in increasingly dangerous situations, Onita filled stadiums with die-hard fans and became a global icon of hardcore wrestling.
As much as they were known for the brutality, it was really the imagination that made that company click.
A no-rope barbed wire match, and then they go to the exploding barbed wire, then they go to the exploding ring, and like the electrified pool. It just got crazier and crazier and crazier.
You've got to be just nuttier than a fruitcake to get into one of those matches.
It got too hot and everybody ran to the middle. And everybody saying, get out of here, get out of here, get out of here.
The promotion's meteoric rise was followed by an equally spectacular crash that left its top star paralyzed and its new CEO dead. Some place the blame for FMW's tragic downfall on its founder, who sacrificed everything for fame and fortune.
Some of my dad's fans say that he killed my father.
Did he run over some people? I'm sure he did. But it was necessary to be Atsushi Onita. Superstar.
I am Atsushi Onita. Yeah. はじめまして。それは馬場さんのですね、ジャイアント台風っていう漫画があったんですよ。それを見た時にですね、いやー、プロレスってすごいなって。マジソンスキアガーデンでね、試合ができる日本人っていうのは素晴らしいなと思ってですね。もうプロレスしかない。世界に行けるのはプロレスしかないと思ってですね。
Japan's vibrant wrestling culture was popularized by Giant Baba's All Japan Pro Wrestling and Antonio Inoki's New Japan Pro Wrestling. Both championed an authentic, hard-hitting style. When Texan brawlers Terry and Dory Funk came over to perform, their over-the-top Western personas instantly captivated Japanese audiences.
その時ファンクスっていうドリー・テリーっていうのはもう爆発的な人気だったですから日本で憧れの人だったですね。
For some reason, the people took to me in Japan. Meaner than a rattlesnake, tougher than shoe leather, more dangerous than a hollow-eyed scorpion, middle-aged and crazy, crazy like a fox. You know who that is? That is me. The best there ever was. Oh my God! And the best there ever will be. Terry Funk. All right, ask me some questions.
And Terry Funk is one of the most universally loved performers in Japanese history, and he'd worked All Japan, he'd worked New Japan. He'd be known as an all-time great. My name is Chris Jericho, and I worked for 2 tours in FMW. Onita was a guy that started out in I think it was All Japan, and he was kind of a high flyer. A young disciple of Giant Baba, Onita rose through the ranks of All Japan's dojo system before being sent to America to further his craft and learn from the styles of the West.
Japanese wrestlers would be sent to the different wrestling territories to further learn their trade. It was almost like an apprenticeship. My name is Mick Foley. I'm known as the King of the Deathmatch. But for a few years, I was the American Onita. And that was a huge, huge compliment. Well, Terry had told me that Onita was sent to Amarillo. Onita was very drawn to Terry's style.
He had watched me in barbed wire matches, and he really idolized me. That's why he came to Amarillo. Be like Terry Funk, you know, and what a horrible thing to want to be. He wanted to be an idiot, too.
レスラー同士のコミュニケーションというかコミュニティがあるんですよ。それで僕はやっぱり一番信用してたのがテリー・バンクだから。
A mighty fine tractor right here out on a double cross ranch.
When Onita arrived in Amarillo, he was recovering from recent injuries suffered in the Dominican Republic. After refusing to lose to an opponent he deemed inferior, Onita was taught a painful lesson by the promoter.
He didn't agree with what they wanted to do with him, and they beat him up. But it wasn't one guy, it was all of them. Rat-packed him.
袋叩きに遭うんですよ。テリーが可愛がってくれたし。
What was your first impression of him when you first met him?
Nuts. I spoke Japanese like he spoke English. He spoke English like I spoke Japanese. We both were lost. But we got along. I was there for him, I really was. And I bought him a used car. And I got him a job and sent him on the road.
The Japanese team of Mr. Onita and Masafuchi.
After Onita recovers from his injuries, he and fellow protege Masafuchi travel to Memphis, Tennessee to battle in the infamous Tupelo concession stand brawl.
Into the concession stand after tearing down the partition.
僕は原点はテネシーだと思ってますね。
Slams Onita totally covered there by that big fan.
お客さんがヒートするんですね。普通の試合より。
Onita pulling himself over the counter.
それで僕は一回あまりにもお客さんがヒートしすぎて女性がですね僕の顔をですねハイヒールで蹴るんですよ。蹴った瞬間バキッとこう切れてですね鼻から血がダーッと出て、これはやっぱりハードコアっていうのは人間を本当に興奮させるんだっていう、と思いましたね。そこにヒントがありましたね。
With an improved skill set and a willingness to inject thrilling violence into his matches, Onita makes a return to All Japan Pro Wrestling. On the cusp of main event stardom, a freak accident results in a devastating injury.
それで足のところからですね骨が皮膚を突き破って飛び出してきたんですよ。それでバラバラになったんですよ、お皿がね。それでもう再起不能だって言われたんですけど、悩みましたね。悩んだし、どうやっていいかもう分からなかったですね。
The injury permanently hinders Onita's athleticism, instantly ending his dreams of becoming a high-flying star.
He was limited as an athlete. He realized that his future in wrestling lie in the powers of perseverance and imagination.
What do you do when you're in your late 20s, early 30s, and your whole career is gone? Well, he created something that had never been done before. After years of working odd jobs, Onita's thirst for stardom drives him to devise a bold stunt. He publicly challenges real-life karate champion Masashi Oyagi to compete in a groundbreaking series of brutal matches pitting wrestler against martial artists.
人を呼ぶっていうのはそこになんかこう魅力がないとダメですから、試合じゃなくて会場自体がお客さん自体がこうぶつかり合う煽るプロレスリングが面白いかな。
Building upon the violence Onita was exposed to in America, their rivalry makes headlines and draws massive crowds.
これはもしかしたらいけるかもしれない、やれるかもしれないと思いました。
By the time Onita claims victory in their final bout, his frontier martial arts wrestling promotion is officially born.
FMW.
And FMW had a really good thing going because they gave you a full course meal. You know, you got your technical wrestling, flying wrestling, incredible women. But the hallmark was always the blood and guts. It was like a buffet of brutality.
一つのものっていうのは飽きられますか？エンターテインメントでベリーインポーテントなのは飽きられない。
The thinking that goes behind replacing ring ropes with barbed wire is the audience comes first. We care about them far more than the safety of the people doing this. And real injuries are not a bad thing. They're encouraged, and they are impossible to avoid.
子供の頃に有刺鉄線が張ってあるところに入って怪我をするわけです。有刺鉄線は怖いという印象があるということは、見てる人たちも有刺鉄線は怖い。
How would you describe a typical FMW hardcore match? What are the things you'd see in it?
A lot of guys that would go to no end to self-annihilation of their bodies to have a better match than what the opposition did.
Okay, the barbed wire isn't enough. We're gonna have to rig up like electrical shocks to it. Like this was insane.
僕はそういった人がやらないババズオフィスや猪木ズオフィスがやらないことを徹底的にやろうって考えましたから。
To compete with Japan's two major promotions, FMW matches feature increasingly dangerous stunts that result in legitimate bloodshed.
I was at an FMW show where one of the female wrestlers got hit with a fireball. And her outfit, it burned the fabric into her skin. And I'm getting ready to do my match, and I just hear these almost otherworldly sounds of suffering. Tears streaming down her face, sobs like I have never heard before. And it's like, we talk about a price that's really, really steep. And I had to block that out of my mind and go about with my main event match.
Onita's FMW roster includes like-minded performers Tarzan Goto, Mr. Pogo, Masato Tanaka, the Gladiator aka Mike Awesome, as well as up-and-coming talent with North American experience.
People want to see the action. People want to see something different. Hi, this is Ricky Fuji from FMW. People never seen before, like in a crowd, fighting each other, like beside the boom, 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 the bloody, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. So that's why a lot of people were excited.
We had a connection with a guy called Ricky Fuji who had spent time in Calgary that was able to bring some guys over to FMW. My first match ever in FMW was the main event, which is hilarious when you think about a 20-year-old Chris Jericho in the main event against a karate expert who was just beating the shit out of me. They would be in there kicking you as hard as they could because that's all they knew how to do. I was like, what the hell am I doing here?
So I was never invited. It was completely luck. I'm Sabu. I was in FMW for 3 years, New Japan for a year, and then independent the rest of my life.
There goes Sabu. What's it? Oh, did you see that? For the love of God!
My uncle was the Sheik, and he was a great guy. He was a mean guy, and he was a nice guy. Onita and Tarzan Goto, they were young boys when the Sheik and Abdullah the Butcher was in Japan in the early 70s and 80s. Every time they came to town, they took care of those two guys. So 20 years later, Onita starts a company, and he calls up the Sheik and says, we're gonna have a tag team tournament. You can come and bring anybody you want. He goes, I'll bring my nephew. And he could have chose anybody, but he chose me.
What's it like to work with barbed wire?
Oh, it sucks. It sucks. The first barbed wire match, I got hurt. They took me to the hospital. I was in there all night long getting stitches. After that, I never went to the hospital. It took too long. So I started crazy gluing my cuts and then taping them. I basically taped and glued up all the boys too.
A single barb can do a lot of damage in a hurry. and it has. There are some gaping wounds. You know, Sabu really paid the price, you know, with a roadmap of scars. Makes me look like like a preschooler.
FMW's wrestlers sacrifice their bodies on a nightly basis, but none can connect with the audience quite like the promotion's founder and star, Atsushi Onita.
Onita had an ability to allow people to feel his pain and see themselves in him. Some people can't connect with a larger-than-life superhero. They can connect with somebody who looks like they do, who is limited physically, but not limited of will.
毎日ねジュースを流す、血を流す、もう倒れそうになり、苦しかったですけど。
You know, there's man against man, man against himself, and now you enter man against the wire, man against flames, where you're making a living, you're putting on a show, you're doing what you love, but you're also facing fear on a nightly basis. And you have to tackle it, and you have to earn their respect, and you have to embrace it wholeheartedly.
The whole end of his match would be basically crying in front of the fans. The meaning was he had given it his all, and he was crying because the fans had stood behind him. And they played Joan Jett's version of Wild Thing, and everybody would get up out of their seats and crowd around the ringside as he poured water on his head and cried. And dude, it got over so huge.
Onita does some big show and stadium arena. Right after, he's going to ambulance. In the ambulance, he thinks himself, okay, what's the next? That's what I heard, yeah.
爆発をね使ったりとか、港で試合をやったり、プールの中でこう試合をやったりとかっていうの。全部僕のアイデアですね。
So if he could think it, he was going to do it. And I think there was a reasonably good chance that he was going to die in that ring.
In Onita's pursuit to consistently top himself, a tag team match with Tarzan Goto versus Sabu and his 65-year-old uncle, the Sheik, goes terribly wrong.
Where did the idea for this fire match come from?
I don't know. I assumed Puerto Rico because they had one before, and Onita wanted to top it. I didn't care. I figured they know what they're doing. They know it would be safe.
Wow, that's taking things outside of your own hands and trusting the environment someone else has created for you. I'm not comfortable with that, and I've seen a lot of people get burned, literally.
It got too hot, way too fast. If it was a building, I would have jumped off it.
どんどんどんどん燃え盛るんですね。はい。それで、空気がどんどんどんどんリング内の空気がどんどんなくなっていくんですよ。
There's a FMW logo in the middle. It melted in our hands. It melted in our elbows, hands, and knees. You couldn't hear nothing. You couldn't breathe. It was a roar. I jumped out and immediately turned around through a bucket of water.
それでターザン後藤が逃げて、もうこれはいけないと思って僕も逃げたんですよ。だけど申し訳ありませんけど、シークさんだけちょっと逃げ遅れた。助けに行くことできません。シークさんが最後に残ってるのを僕が見たときに、はっきり言って周り全部火ですから、助けに行けないわけです。
But he went out the other side. I didn't see that. He got burned by the fire pretty bad.
シークさんが 60% ですかね。やけどして。
My uncle carried on wrestling Onita outside the ring, and I was trying to throw water on my uncle because he had his back burned up. I threw a bucket of water on him, and the skin on his back came off.
大変なことになりました。
Were you angry at all with Onita or anybody else about how dangerous that was?
I wasn't angry at anybody. I was angry that it was bad, and the plan was bad. I can't be angry at Onita. He gave me life.
Riding high with an expanding fan base and sold-out shows, Onita revels in the trappings of his newfound stardom.
He may have started as a scrappy underdog, and he became the king and was treated as such.
And he had sticky fingers. He took all the money.
僕の成功っていうのはいろんな副作用があって、僕を変えたものっていうのは、変えたものはビッグヘッドになったでしょうね。それでまた自分のね家も 4LDK になって、それで車も5台ぐらい持って、だからその時のこう成功した時の年収っていうのはやっぱり一番いい時は2億ぐらい。
Onita's fortune is not only gained from the violence he presents in the ring, but from ties with the nefarious underworld.
So, the Yakuza, the Japanese mob, how much were they a part of wrestling promotions in Japan at the time?
They were in control of the arenas. So the Yakuza were definitely there.
It's kind of almost like a money laundering scheme, holding shows that the mafia will kind of sponsor and put on.
We would go out to dinner sometimes with sponsors, and I would just check out their pinkies. And by and large, a lot of the sponsors were missing their pinkies because of the line of business they were in, where sections of the pinkies would be eliminated. I wasn't comfortable with it, but I accepted that that was part of what made the scene possible.
Well, they told us to stay away from a certain section, and I go, well, there's not many people in that section, who cares? It was because that was the mafia section, and like they had like 10 people there with 50 chairs empty because nobody was they were scared to sit by them. I started biting over there anyways, and they wouldn't move for us. Usually people move. He's a mafia boss, we don't know that. But then later on, we're in the dressing room getting bang, bang, bang on the door. They're looking for us. I run down this hallway and I got trapped. And a bunch of these Japanese guys would knock me down. And when I was down, I was getting boot kicked. And then all of a sudden, Mike Awesome was there.
Mike Awesome, you know, the huge monster heel.
Guys started getting flung off. Mike Awesome would start throwing guys off and saved my life. I loved him after that.
In 4 short years, Onita overcame his injury to build a promotion to rival his competitors. To celebrate, Onita invites his mentor from America to participate in FMW's most spectacular stunt to date. So they had an exploding ring death match, and they were really smart in bringing in Terry Funk. For him to come to FMW, it changed the perception of this company. Terry's here?
テリー・ファンクが初めて FMW に来た時に、なんで俺が成功したかって証明するためには、そのお金じゃないんですね。お金じゃなくて、やっぱりたくさんの人から、あ、大仁田は成功してるんだ。
It was stadium full, about 30, 40,000. And they don't charge 50 cents a ticket over there either. There's the idiots, is the front row people. We're gonna have an exploding ring match tonight. Well, I want a front row ticket. Bullshit.
Did they show you where the explosives were gonna be and stuff?
Why, hell no. I had no idea. I just went out to the damn ring. I'm a glutton for a crowd being into a match, you know. I was just out there ready to capture that crowd. And we did.
なんていうのかな、全身で 人がこう応援してくれる。ね、5万人の観衆の中に立った時に、俺は I am God.
So the siren starts going off. And at the end of this time clock, the ring would explode. And finally, Onita gets the win, and he leaves the ring. And this thing is going down 45 seconds, 30 seconds. And Onita realizes that his hero, almost the god of Japanese pro wrestling, is going to be exploded in this ring. So he goes back inside the ring and he tries to wake Funker up, and he can't wake him up, and now it's 10 seconds. He can't wake him up, so what does he do? He shields Terry Funk with his body. And it's a bunch of like boom, 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 concussion bombs and fireworks, and just by the time it's done, you can't see anything. It was the greatest babyface thing I've ever seen in my life. He covered Terry Funk to save him from the explosion after he pinned him. That's Onita. What FMW did the best was create a spectacle. You know, Funk survived thanks to Onita, and they were kind of like carrying each other, crying once again, and Funk was great at it too, crying, crying, crying. To me, it's a 5-star match because it had the drama and hooked you into it to where you cared. And that's the real secret of what wrestling is. That's what Onita really knew how to do. He was a genius at it.
Do you remember being satisfied with what you were paid on that match?
Well, hell no, I wasn't satisfied. I never saw an Onita after a match either till I came back the next time. I think he ran and hid.
FMW was at least the number 3 promotion in the country, if not number 2, depending on what was going on with the 2 big ones at the time. He legit was one of the most popular performers in the country, and not just in wrestling. He was doing game shows.
A TV drama or singing show, something like a talk show. Almost every day, like turn the TV on, Onita was there all the time, yeah.
He'd become such a big part of the culture. I think Onita had bigger plans.
In just 5 short years after creating FMW, Onita announces his retirement, which comes as a shock to his fans.
He didn't want to do it anymore. He had enough. And you can fail and not have any money at all. Or you can go out like he did with several $1 million, I'm sure.
Onita continues to headline shows for another full year while the promotion grooms a young wrestler to become his future headlining successor.
Hayabusa was the heir apparent to Onita. He was, the word that's coming is elegant, but he was also willing to do the extreme stuff.
E.G. Izaki is his name, who later became Hayabusa. We worked together quite a bit. My second tour at Kawasaki Stadium was against Izaki. And at the time, the big move that he did was a moonsault, which nobody did.
もともと多分父プロレス向きの体格じゃなくてそんな向いている感じじゃなかったと思うんですけど、そこで修行して私は江崎彩音ではやぶさは父です。父は結構そのしたいことをする突っ走るタイプなので、その過激派レスラーの方が合ってたのかなとは思います。
At FMW's 6th anniversary show, Onita's retirement match features the special effects and extreme gore that made him an icon. But his opponent is out of his element.
だからはやぶさには悪いな。そしてまた申し訳ないですけど、デスマッチをやる選手ではないなと僕思ってましたね。引退の時っていうのはある種どんどんみそぎをしてるんですね、自分の中で反省をしたり、リングを去っていく、 寂しいもんですよ。
プロレスに初めて胸いっぱいになれるんじゃ。お前ら一生一回でいいから自分の好きなこと胸いっぱいやってみや。いらといらといらとリングにあげるんだよ。早くさ。はい。
Onita leaving FMW, that would create a huge hole that I think would be next to impossible to fill, just because of how synonymous with that company he was. And vice versa, it'd be hard to see Onita anywhere else other than thinking FMW. They're one and the same.
お前ら、俺は新しい世界に行くから、どっちが社長になるかっていうのを聞いたんですね。
An unlikely successor emerges to take the reins of FMW, the promotion's ring announcer, Shoichi Arai. 240 impact, Landstorm, Chris Jericho! And he's kind of like kind of a chubby guy, and kind of wore a tuxedo that was a little bit too small for him. But then you hear like Arai is the new like general manager. Like really? Like wow. Like well, why not? Like he was probably at every show.
Onita retire, then after okay, you are the president. What? He don't know what to do.
My dad was really nice person. He was really pure. So I didn't know why he was trying to get into that company. I still don't understand. My name is Shell, and Shoichi Arai is my dad. Onita suddenly says that, okay, I'm gonna give this company to you. You can do whatever you want. But he has no knowledge at all.
Excuse my language, but he gave jack shit to the ring announcer. He didn't give nothing to him. I'll promise you that. I'll swear to it.
Before, like Onita was there in the FMW, everywhere, always packed the arena. Many people. New FMW started, then they just little people.
Without Onita's star power, FMW's popularity wanes. After just one starring film role, Onita realizes his appeal is limited when he's not wrestling. Less than a year after his retirement, he unexpectedly returns to FMW to work for his former ring announcer.
僕が戻ってきた時に、僕はヒールで戻ろうと思って悪役として FMW 新しい新生 FMW と旧 FMW がぶつかり合えば面白いと。東京でやればハヤブサたちあーっとこうみんなが拍手する。で俺がヒールになる。だけど田舎出れば違うんですよ。全く違う現象が起きるんですよ。僕の方が知名度あるしビッグネームだから、お客さんは僕をこうやって拍手する。だけど不思議なことにそれはジェラシーでしかなかった。その辺のジレンマがぶつかり合ってどんどんこう溝ができたんじゃないですかね。
When Arai was running the company, he kind of wanted to move away from death matches, right?
Yes, because they wouldn't air our stuff only on specials because it was too violent.
To take FMW in a new direction, Arai hires veteran Japanese star Hiromichi Fuyuki to handle the company's creative direction.
That's why like something changed. Arai always like ask Fuyuki. Then Fuyuki say do this. Fuyuki wants to do some like entertainment style.
He had a belt called World Entertainment Wrestling, like WWE, but World Entertainment Wrestling. And they stopped having death matches.
最後の頃さ、ね、P じゃないけど、おしっ 個引っ掛けるアングル作ったりとか悲惨だったですもんね FMW ね。何があれがエンターテインメントか僕には分からなかったですね。
The tug of war between Onita's vision for FMW and Fuyuki's new direction forces Arai to arrange a meeting with his top talent.
その3日前にそのミーティングを開く、そのミーティングもですねビデオの打ち合わせだって言って僕行ったんですよ。嘘をつかれたんですね新井社長に。それで行ったらですね選手が並んでて「本田さんやめてください」
Yeah, I said to Onita, please leave FMW. We gotta do this and on top of the Hayabusa.
ね、自分が作った FMW を追い出されるというね。
While Hayabusa struggled to draw the crowds of his predecessor, his athletic style was winning new fans and realizing success for FMW. Until tragedy struck on October 22nd, 2001.
He did a second rope moonsault and his foot slipped and he went backwards and landed on his forehead.
Before, because he missed something, he always get up. By the time the watching, he never get up.
Hayabusa! ちょっとはやぶさがピクッとも動きません。はやぶさ！ちょっとはやぶさがピクッとも動きません。
I step in the ring. Hayabusa, he's like my brother. He can talk, but he can't move.
He didn't die. It was worse. He was paralyzed. I'd rather have died.
今たまらず新井社長が、そしてタンカ。
Just terrible injury to happen to just a great guy, a great performer, and a legit kind of future legend. All the boxes that need to be checked, he had it.
怪我した当時は多分父本当に絶望的だったんで、多分プロレス自分のしてた仕事プロレスができなくなってこれからどうしようみたいな。
His career was cut short in his prime, and I think with his career went the future of FMW. They never really found somebody to replace Hayabusa.
Beyond being a serious emotional blow to FMW and his fans, Hayabusa's injury also sets in motion a financial disaster. Without their star attraction, Arai struggles to keep his fledgling company afloat.
I said, wait, please wait. I'll never get paid.
I remember that my mom say, "Don't steal house money" or something.
And what do you think that meant? Was he using the money from the family to help pay for the business?
Oh, yes.
確かに僕は逆に言うと闇金から借りても恩田さん助けてくださいっていうのは新井社長のプライドとしてできなかったんじゃないですか。
He owed money from the Yakuza and he couldn't pay them back. His phone was ringing all the time. My mom was like panic and she screamed. So I thought it's not a good thing. My mom and dad, like they divorced. And I think he was really suffering. And I didn't realize because I was too young.
And then my last match there, we didn't get paid. He said he'd send it to me, and then he killed himself the next day. Hung himself in a schoolyard. When you borrow money from the Japanese mafia, even if you kill yourself, they're going to get their money from your family. So that wasn't the end of the story. They're saying he was selfish for doing that, a coward, because now his family owes that money, and they'll get it.
Arai's death triggers a life insurance payment, but it's sadly not enough to cover his family's newly inherited debt.
They came my home suddenly And they changed the key and they changed everything. And we couldn't get in our house anymore. My picture, my video, my memories was all in that house, but it's all gone. That's why I don't have anything.
新井選手が死んだって俺はもう死んだ人のことを悪口言いたくないけどやっぱりビジネスに失敗したんだよ。俺は生き残ってるっていうのは生き残ってんだよ。
I feel a little bit that Onita used my dad. A lot of people say that he was too kind and too pure. That's why he gone.
新井が悪くなったらさ女房逃げてさ女房逃げてさそれで多分それがショックだったんだろう、ね、首をつったっていう借金なんかどうでもいいんだよね。ヤクザに殺されたとかさ闇金に殺されたのはよくわかるけどさ、そうじゃないわけじゃん。じゃあ借金なんかばっくりりゃいいんだよね。払えませんって言ったらそのまでだね。精神的なもんで追い詰められたんだよ。
Over a decade later, FMW briefly rises from the ashes, with Onita back in the ring and Hayabusa acting as an executive producer. But less than a year later, tragedy strikes again when Hayabusa collapses in his home and dies at the age of 47.
はやぶさとしてのプロレスを全うしてたのもすごいことだと思いますし、すっごい大怪我をしたにもかかわらず、めげずに新しいことにどうぞ調整しようという姿勢は、怪我した時とかも怪我した後リハビリの時とかも私たちの前とかではずっと笑顔。
He did walk again. I mean, it's one of the most gut-wrenching things you see when he's surrounded by members of wrestling royalty from several different promotions. And it's one of the most emotional moments you will ever see when Hayabusa walks to the ring. FMW was the wild, wild west of professional wrestling. I mean, it was in the East geographically, but it was this lawless, wild frontier. If you could think it, you could do it. The spectacle always came first. And it was a big part of wrestling history and something that's still borrowed from to this day.
逆に言うとハードコアというものを本格的に作ったのは僕だと思う。それを全世界に広めたのは僕だと思ってます。
What I learned in FMW, of course, I took it to ECW. ECW was formed from FMW.
Onita basically built a promotion around himself, an undersized underdog wrestler, and made it a huge success.
If you could say anything to him right now, what would you say? Is there any reason that you want to flick him off?
No, hell no. I love him.
じゃあハルク・ホーガンの代わりにハルク・ホーガンがいるかっていないんですよ。やっぱりハルク・ホーガン、ハルク・ホーガン、アントニー猪木はアントニー猪木、ジャイアント・ババア、ジャイアント・ババア、大仁田敦は大仁田敦、多分一代限りだと思う。
College. He took a swig of red food coloring, leaped off a bed onto a stuffed item resting on a concrete floor, and spat out a concoction of fake blood. When a girl in his dormitory called it the most disgusting thing she had ever seen, Foley felt an immense rush of power. He realized that if he could not make people love him in the traditional sense, perhaps he could captivate them by disgusting them. He just needed to get reactions. He needed to be noticed, and thus, the hardcore legend was born. The Hell in a Cell match serves as a perfect gateway for new viewers. Countless fans point to that specific bout as their introduction to the sport. But as his daughter Noelle Foley points out, it sets an impossibly high and dangerous standard. A normal Mick Foley match is quite hardcore, brutal, and filled with blood, thumbtacks, and fire. According to footage from his time in Japan, he would be thrown into barbed wire, survive explosions from composition 4 explosives, take spears through flaming tables, and endure sickening bumps directly onto solid concrete. He put his physical body through an unimaginable amount of trauma, simply to elicit a shocked gasp from the crowd. Realism was his ultimate tool. Foley himself admitted that he did not think he was having a good match unless he had physical trouble walking back to his hotel room. It was not that he enjoyed the pain itself. Rather, he enjoyed the fact that he could absorb that pain and sell it in a way that entertained the masses. However, this commitment placed an enormous burden on his loved ones. His wife, Colette Foley, who has known him for over 35 years, initially fell in love with his gentle nature, his nice personality, and his terrible sense of humor. Their wedding song was Beauty and the Beast, a perfect metaphor for their dynamic. She understood his commitment to his craft. She knew that when the adrenaline was pumping, his only drive was to ensure the audience left talking about how great the show was, even at great risk to his own life. Foley had developed an alter ego named Cactus Jack, a wild and crazy persona that made audiences legitimately question his sanity. Legendary manager and producer Jim Cornette noted that Foley had undeniable charisma and an incredible grasp of match psychology. He understood that the fans gravitated towards characters who appeared out of control, characters who seemed to be going entirely against the script. Foley could take the audience on an unpredictable ride, eliciting the exact response he desired. His journey to the top was anything but conventional. According to Foley, his early bedroom furniture consisted merely of a mattress on the floor, a black and white television, and a video cassette recorder that barely worked. He would spend up to 12 hours a day watching Japanese wrestling tapes, studying the realism and the intense storytelling. In those matches, it was not just man versus man. The competitors had to defeat their brutal surroundings. He believed Japan was where he would make his living. The Japanese promoters were looking for a foreign talent to feud with the legendary Terry Funk. Funk was universally respected for his unmatched ability to make people suspend their disbelief. He became a mentor to Foley, and together they engaged in explosive, violent, fiery death matches across Japan. Foley was naturally drawn to the wild elements of the business. If he was crawling on his hands and knees in agony, he considered it proof that he had created something special. Because of this extreme style, Foley never envisioned himself becoming a top star in the World Wrestling Federation. During that era, the company was producing general audience programming. It was a sanitized, bland product, and Foley's brutal style simply did not gel with what they were selling. Al Snow, a former superstar and Foley's closest travel partner, noted that the company chairman, Vince McMahon, had absolutely no desire to hire Mick Foley. McMahon did not think Foley was marketable and did not find him physically attractive for television. It took the persistent lobbying of Jim Ross, who was serving as the vice president of talent relations, to convince McMahon to take a chance. The company desperately needed compelling opponents for The Undertaker, who was one of the biggest stars in the history of the industry. McMahon kept booking slow, giant men against The Undertaker, which resulted in dull television. Jim Ross argued that what The Undertaker needed was a lunatic, according to backstage lore. McMahon finally slammed his hand on a table and agreed to bring Foley in, but under the strict condition that his face be completely covered by a mask. McMahon's initial perception was that Foley was a nobody. From that mandate, the character of Mankind was born. Hall of Famer Gerald Briscoe recalled the immense challenge of building a character around someone the boss inherently did not believe in. Yet, the character worked. It worked because of Foley's absolute dedication. Without a deep, emotional connection to the audience, any character is meaningless. Fans possess a sixth sense. They can feel genuine commitment. Ross's goal was to make Foley a legendary opponent for The Undertaker. But that came with the heavy responsibility of keeping Foley from killing himself in the ring. Going into the summer of 1998, Mankind and The Undertaker had already built a tremendous foundation. having wrestled 7 pay-per-view matches and 10 television matches across the globe. However, Foley felt his character had plateaued. He believed he needed to do something drastic to add to their legacy. The producers planned to reignite the feud utilizing the Hell in a cell structure. The original concept, credited to Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker, involved putting a solid roof on a steel cage, ensuring that the only way to win was inside the ring. Their first encounter was a critical masterpiece. Foley, by his own admission, felt inadequate when comparing his athletic abilities to those of Shawn Michaels. He sought advice from Terry Funk. According to the sources, Funk jokingly suggested that they should start the match on top of the cell roof, and that Foley should be thrown off. While Funk meant it as a dark joke, Foley took it as a serious blueprint. Foley pitched the idea of being thrown off the cell to McMahon and The Undertaker. Initially, The Undertaker was highly reluctant to throw a man off a structure that height, but Foley was dead set on the idea, viewing it not as a second act for his career, but simply as a desperate measure to keep his head above water. The Undertaker eventually agreed, trusting Foley's assurance that if he could visualize the stunt, he could execute it safely. As the competitors made their entrances at the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, the tension was palpable. Commentator Jerry Lawler noted the immense pressure Foley must have felt, knowing he had to outdo the previous critically acclaimed cell match while lacking the natural agility of other performers. Former referee Jimmy Corderas and producer Gerald Briscoe watched closely from the backstage monitors, completely unaware of the true extent of the chaos about to unfold. The match began in a way no one had ever witnessed. Instead of entering the cage doors, Foley began climbing the steel mesh to the roof. Jim Ross and the audience were in a state of shock. Foley later admitted that despite his confident pitch, he was terrified of heights. As The Undertaker followed him up, the reality of the situation set in. The roof was secured with plastic zip ties, which were never designed to hold 600 pounds of human weight. With every step the two heavyweights took, the mesh sank by a terrifying foot. The unmistakable sound of zip ties snapping echoed through the arena. Foley attempted a suplex on the roof, but The Undertaker wisely cut the move off. Realizing the entire structure was on the verge of collapsing, they gravitated toward the edge of the cell, directly above the broadcast position. No one genuinely believed Foley would take a tumble from that height. There was simply zero margin for error. The announcers' tables below looked like tiny dollhouse furniture. Then the unthinkable happened. From a height of almost 20 feet, a 300-pound human being was hurled over the edge, plummeting rapidly toward the floor. To those watching, time seemed to slow down, yet it was over in the blink of an eye. Foley crashed violently through the Spanish announcer's table. The sound of the impact was sickening. The reaction backstage was one of pure, explosive panic. It was described as being akin to witnessing a fatal car accident. Many genuinely believed Foley had died upon impact. Jim Ross screamed on commentary, completely breaking the standard broadcast presentation. At home, Colette Foley tried to soothe her terrified children by claiming it was fake, while privately panicking. Foley's ability to survive the fall was credited to his mid-air rotation, landing as flat as possible to cushion the blow. Medical personnel, including Dr. Francois Petit, flooded the ringside area. The Spanish commentator, Hugo Savanovic, was torn between his genuine concern for his friend and the unwritten rule of not interfering with the performance. Terry Funk was the first to reach Foley, checking to see if he was conscious. The medical staff brought out a gurney, a process complicated by the fact that it would not fit through the chaotic ringside setup, forcing the crew to mechanically raise the cell with The Undertaker still standing on top of it. Everyone believed the match was over. Foley was strapped to gurney, seemingly destined for the emergency room. However, as the medical team wheeled him down the aisle, the unimaginable occurred. Foley rolled off the gurney. Despite the pleas of officials, referees, and his peers screaming at him to stop, Foley began to climb the cell once again. To the locker room, he appeared to be the craziest son of a gun in the history of the business. Foley later stated that he had pledged to complete the match and he was determined to see it through, despite having no idea how he would survive. The second major stunt was meant to be much safer. The plan called for a choke slam on the roof, which would cause the mesh to slowly give way, allowing The Undertaker to dramatically stuff Foley into the ring. But the failing zip ties altered destiny. When The Undertaker delivered the move, the cage panel completely gave way instantly. Foley plummeted straight down, crashing violently onto the unforgiving ring mat. Unlike the first fall, which was somewhat broken by the table, this impact was brutal, unmitigated force against solid wood and steel. Worse still, a heavy steel folding chair fell for the hole right behind him, striking him directly in the face upon impact. This second fall was not planned, and the reaction was one of sheer terror. Colette Foley was at home desperately trying to call the company, furious and believing her husband had lied to her about the match layout. In the ring, Foley was legitimately knocked unconscious for the first time in his career. A full 42 seconds passed where he was completely unresponsive. Dr. Petit and Terry Funk rushed into the ring. According to those present, Foley's eyes were completely vacant. The Undertaker stood above the hole, looking down with genuine fear, asking Funk to check if Foley was even breathing. Funk, in a brilliant moment of improvisation, provoked The Undertaker into attacking him, buying precious time for the medical staff to assess Foley without stopping the broadcast. In today's landscape, the match would have been immediately stopped. But during that era, officials bought time instead of calling for the bell. When Foley finally regained consciousness, his first sight was Terry Funk's shoes. As the mental fog began to lift, his performer instincts took over. Bleeding profusely from a massive wound under his lip, he pushed his tongue through the hole in his face, creating a grotesque and unforgettable television image. A tooth had been knocked completely out of his mouth and, through the heavy breathing and trauma, had somehow lodged itself inside his nasal passage. Despite suffering a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, a bruised kidney, and severe concussion symptoms, Foley insisted on finishing the planned sequence. He introduced thousands of metal thumbtacks into the ring, purposely throwing himself onto them to ensure the crowd received the maximum spectacle. After 17 grueling minutes, The Undertaker finally secured the victory. The aftermath was sobering. The Pittsburgh crowd gave Foley a hero's ovation, fully realizing the authentic physical sacrifice they had just witnessed. Backstage, Vince McMahon approached Foley, expressing deep gratitude for what he had done for the company, but sternly demanding that Foley promise never to do anything like it again. The medical staff plucked the thumbtacks from Foley's flesh as he dazedly asked The Undertaker if they had remembered to perform the thumbtack sequence, completely unaware that it had already happened. Colette Foley spent the evening waiting in agony for a phone call, finally screaming at her husband when he called hours later, informing him that his children thought he was dead. While the Hell in a Cell match fundamentally changed Foley's career trajectory, catapulting him to the World Wrestling Federation Championship within 6 months, it also set a terrifying precedent. The bar had been raised to an impossible height. He felt a profound obligation to live up to the moniker of the hardcore legend, pushing the limits of physical human endurance. Just 7 months later, he engaged in an I Quit match against The Rock. The match design called for Foley to be handcuffed and take severe punishment, but the execution went horrifyingly far. Instead of the planned 5 unprotected chair shots to the head, Foley absorbed 11 brutal strikes. The footage of the I Quit match remains incredibly difficult to watch. His young children were in the front row, traumatized by the sight of their father being systematically battered. As Noel Foley reflected years later, the fact that a normal person could have died from 11 headshots is sickening. Foley admitted that he often chose to endure maximum pain simply because he believed it looked better for the audience. The long-term consequences of these decisions are tragic. Foley suffered concussion upon concussion. Doctors warned him repeatedly that continuing his career would leave him crippled. He experienced severe memory lapses, sometimes driving around his own neighborhood, entirely unable to remember where he lived. according to medical experts and neurosurgeons cited in the documentation. The trauma Foley endured is consistent with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a terrifying brain disease caused by repetitive head impacts. The wrestling industry has learned a great deal about brain trauma since those days, equating the physical bumps in the ring to enduring a 25-mile-per-hour car crash on a nightly basis. Today, Foley's family lives with a constant, agonizing worry about what his neurological health will look like in 10 or 20 years. Yet, despite the immense physical toll, Foley remains a complex figure who views his legacy with a mixture of pride and acceptance. For a period of time, he harbored deep resentment that he was solely remembered for the traumatic hell in a cell match. However, a conversation with The Undertaker helped him realize that what they created that night would outlive them both. Foley performed spoken word shows to keep his mind sharp, still craving the stimulation and the roar of the crowd. He acknowledges that he cannot condemn his dangerous choices, without also admitting that those vary. Choices were directly responsible for his massive success. When Mick and his daughter visited the company warehouse and stumbled upon the original cell structure, the emotional weight of his history came crashing down. For the first time in Noelle's memory, her father began to cry, looking at the twisted metal. The reality of how close he came to losing everything became undeniable. The story of mankind in a Hell in a Cell is the ultimate paradox of professional wrestling. It is a story of a man who viewed the ring as a canvas to create surreal, sublime performance art. He subjected his body to unimaginable horrors to secure the love and acceptance of total strangers. According to the historical record and the testimonies of his peers, Mick Foley gave his heart and soul to the industry. The moments he created were magical, terrifying, and extraordinarily powerful. But as we close the book on this chapter of sports entertainment history, the lingering, haunting question remains echoing in the steel. What price is truly too high for immortality? Step into the shadows of sports entertainment history. I have spent my entire life sitting at ringside, calling the action for the biggest organizations in the world, from the World Wrestling Federation to World Championship Wrestling, Extreme Championship Wrestling, Total Nonstop Action, and All Elite Wrestling. I have seen triumphs, and I have seen tragedies. But nothing prepares you for the night of June 28, 1998, on that fateful evening in Pittsburgh, at the World Wrestling Federation King of the Ring pay-per-view event. One match earned its place as perhaps the most shocking spectacle in wrestling history. It was The Undertaker going one-on-one with Mankind inside the unforgiving steel structure known as Hell in a Cell. According to those who witnessed it firsthand, Hell in a Cell hits you like a heavy mallet to the consciousness. As observers noted, everyone in the arena knew it was going to be an intense battle, but no one could have anticipated the sheer madness that was about to unfold. We had two phenomenal talents out there who liked to push the envelope until it practically fell over the edge. People outside the business often say that professional wrestling is scripted, but let me tell you the absolute truth: you cannot fake gravity. I have been frightened by a great many things in professional wrestling over the decades, but nothing frightened me quite as much as that match did, at least until the later stages of the bout. What left fans completely stunned was the unrelenting punishment that Mick Foley, the man behind a Mankind mask, endured. Until you saw it with your own eyes, you simply would not believe that a human being could physically undergo such trauma and live to tell the tale. The match was real. The pain was real. The drama unfolding before a packed house was undeniably real. Watching from the commentary desk, veterans of the industry were screaming in absolute shock, cursing out loud, and calling Foley a lunatic for putting his life on the line. The question that echoed through the arena and through the years was simple: why are you doing this? Today, one of wrestling's most infamous matches persists as both an epic television success and a grim cautionary tale. According to industry insiders, the wrestling world dodged multiple bullets that day. It is truly bewildering to think that an organization would allow someone to go completely unconscious and then just continue the match as if nothing happened. The collateral damage that ensued from that night is a story all its own. When does it stop? When is it ever enough? You pay all day long for the decisions you make during your 15 minutes in the spotlight. It was, without a doubt, a dangerously crazy masterpiece. But all of us, from the fans to the executives, need to ask ourselves a profound question. Was it really worth it? To understand the madness of hell in a cell, you have to understand the psychology of Mick Foley. Everyone who steps into a professional wrestling ring is looking for something they find missing in their own personal lives. According to Foley himself, he was teased heavily during his younger years, which created an overwhelming, almost desperate need to be liked and accepted. He recalled a specific instance from his sophomore year in college. He took a swig of red food coloring and executed a massive leap off a bed onto a stuffed atom on a concrete floor. When he hit the floor, he spit the fake blood concoction out for everyone in the dormitory to see. When one of the female students yelled out that it was the most disgusting thing she had ever witnessed, Foley felt an incredible surge of power. He reasoned that if he could not make people love him, perhaps he could captivate them by disgusting them. He just needed to get a reaction. He would eventually become known as a hardcore legend, the man who survived hell in a cell. Today, that legendary match is often viewed as a perfect gateway for new fans. Countless people have stated that it was the first wrestling match they were ever shown, which instantly turned them into massive fans. But the follow-up question from veterans is always whether those new fans expect every match to be that violent, because they certainly are not. A normal Mick Foley match was already remarkably brutal, typically involving blood, thumbtacks, fire, barbed wire, heavy explosives in Japan, and taking bumps directly on exposed concrete. He willingly put his body through unimaginable amounts of punishment. As his daughter, Noelle Foley, has noted, her father seemed to genuinely love getting that loud. Visceral reaction of disgust and shock from the audience. For Foley, realism was his greatest tool. He admitted that he did not believe he was having a good match unless he had physical trouble simply walking back to his hotel room. It was not that he enjoyed the pain itself. Rather, he enjoyed the fact that he could absorb that pain and present it to the audience in a way that was highly entertaining. His wife, Colette Foley, who has known him for over 35 years, faced a difficult internal struggle when they first met. She had to ask herself if she really wanted to get mixed up with this dangerous world. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw a gentle, kind person. His corny jokes and terrible humor were what ultimately made her fall in love with him. Their wedding song was Even Beauty and the Beast, a perfect metaphor for their relationship. They were a solid team, and she deeply understood his unyielding commitment to his craft. When the adrenaline was pumping through his veins, Foley just wanted the fans to leave the arena talking about how great the show was, completely disregarding his own personal risk. That burning drive pushed him to get crazier and crazier along the way. As he developed his craft, he created a violent persona known as Cactus Jack. Cactus Jack was unpredictable, a wild man who made you question his sanity. Yet, he possessed an undeniable charisma. You simply could not take your eyes off him. Jim Cornette, who worked as an agent and a producer for the World Wrestling Federation during the time of hell in a cell, noted that Foley was an absolute master of in-ring psychology. Foley knew that the fans craved performers who appeared entirely out of control, someone who seemed to be rebelling against the script. He had a unique gift for taking the audience on an emotional ride, eliciting the exact chaotic response he desired. Through this sheer force of will, his reputation began to grow. In those early days, Foley and his wife lived humbly. Their bedroom furniture consisted of a simple mattress on the floor and a black and white television, connected to a video cassette recorder that barely functioned. Foley would spend up to 12 hours a day studying Japanese wrestling tapes. He was drawn to the realism and the intense storytelling of the Japanese death matches, where a wrestler did not just have to defeat their opponent, but also the treacherous surroundings. Foley truly believed that Japan was going to be the place where he made his living. At that time, Japanese promoters were searching for a foreign wrestler who could feud with the legendary Terry Funk. Terry Funk was widely considered the greatest of all time when it came to making an audience suspend their disbelief. Funk soon became a mentor to Foley, and the two began working together in some of the most explosive, bloody, and fiery death matches ever seen in Japan. Foley was always drawn to the extreme. He believed that leaving the ring on his hands and knees was concrete proof that he had delivered something special. It was his unique way of standing out in a crowded industry. Because of his violent style, Foley never envisioned himself working for World Wrestling Entertainment, known then as the World Wrestling Federation. During that era, the company was operating under a general audience rating, presenting a very safe, family-friendly product. Foley's raw, brutal style simply did not mesh with the polished corporate image the company was selling. Al Snow, a former superstar, and Foley's closest travel partner, recalled that Chairman Vince McMahon initially had zero interest in hiring Foley. McMahon did not believe Foley was marketable, nor did he find him visually appealing for television. The man who ultimately convinced McMahon to take a chance on Foley was Jim Ross, the vice president of talent relations at the time. Ross urged McMahon to trust his eye for talent. The company desperately needed fresh, unpredictable dancing partners for their top stars, especially for The Undertaker, who was one of the biggest attractions in the history of the business. McMahon had been feeding The Undertaker a steady diet of massive, slow-moving giants, which was resulting in dull and repetitive matches. What The Undertaker really needed was a lunatic. According to industry lore, McMahon finally slammed his hand on a table and agreed to bring Foley in, but with one strict condition: they were going to cover up his face. McMahon wanted the character to be a complete mystery, erasing Foley's past identity entirely. As Hall of Famer Gerald Briscoe recalled, the creative team was essentially tasked with building a character out of nothing. That is how the character of Mankind was born. Mankind was a tortured mass schizophrenic who dwelled in boiler rooms and pulled his own hair out. It was a bizarre, dark concept that likely would fail miserably with any other performer. But Mick Foley made it work. Without a genuine connection to the audience, a character is meaningless. Fans possess a sixth sense for authenticity, and they could feel Foley's absolute commitment to the role. Ross's goal was for Mankind to be a legendary opponent for The Undertaker, and Foley was willing to try absolutely anything to make that happen. As the old Southern saying goes, he did not turn anything down but the bed covers. This incredible dedication also presented a massive challenge for management. They had to constantly monitor Foley to ensure he did not accidentally end his own life in the ring. The rivalry between Mankind and The Undertaker laid a massive foundation for the company. They battled across the globe, competing in 7 pay-per-view main events and 10 television matches. However, Foley eventually felt that his character had plateaued. He knew he needed to do something drastic, something that would elevate their legacy rather than detract from it. Heading into the King of the Ring event in the summer of 1998, producers decided to reignite the feud using a recently developed match concept called Hell in a Cell. Traditionally, a steel cage match in the company ended when a wrestler climbed over the top or escaped through the door. The Hell in a Cell was different. It had a solid chain link roof. 2 men would enter, and only one would leave. The first ever Hell in a Cell match had taken place 9 months prior between The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels. It was a masterpiece of storytelling and remains the standard bearer for the match type. Foley watched that first match in absolute awe, realizing he possessed none of the athletic agility that Michaels and The Undertaker displayed. Tasked with following that legendary encounter, Foley sought advice from his mentor, Terry Funk. Funk jokingly suggested that they should start the match on top of the cage roof, and then Foley could be thrown off. It was meant to be dark humor, but when Funk stopped laughing, Foley looked at him dead in the eye and said he thought he could actually do it. From that moment on, Foley could not get the idea out of his head. He casually pitched the concept of being thrown off the cell to The Undertaker and Vince McMahon. It was a tremendous sales job by Foley. The Undertaker was extremely hesitant about throwing his opponent off a massive steel structure, but Foley was completely dead set on the idea. Eventually, He managed to get everyone on board. Foley did not view this match as the beginning of a grand second act in his career. He saw it simply as a desperate attempt to keep his head above water. He genuinely believed that after this run was over, his career would be finished. As the fateful night in Pittsburgh arrived, the tension in the Civic Arena was palpable. 16,000 fans eagerly awaited the showdown. Backstage, the atmosphere was thick with anxiety. Jimmy Corderas, a referee and ring crew member at the time, recalled sitting in the production area surrounded by television monitors, watching the events unfold alongside Gerald Briscoe. For the broadcast team of Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler, they were kept completely in the dark, just like the fans watching at home. Foley wanted to start the match in a way no one had ever done before. When Foley began his entrance and immediately started climbing the outside of the cage to the roof, shock washed over the arena. It defied all wrestling logic. Foley had assured McMahon and The Undertaker that he was comfortable being on top of the cell, but the reality was that he was terrified of heights. When The Undertaker made his chilling entrance and joined Foley on the roof, the structural integrity of the cell immediately became a terrifying issue. The top section of the cage was held together merely by plastic zip ties, with over 600 pounds of human weight shifting on the mesh. The roof began to bow downwards by about a foot with every step. The sound of zip ties snapping echoed through the arena. The combatants began trading heavy punches near the edge of the cage, right above the Spanish announce table. Jim Ross watched in sheer disbelief, assuming that there was absolutely no margin for error, and that a fall from that height was simply too dangerous to execute. Looking down from 20 feet in the air, the announcer table looked like a tiny piece of dollhouse furniture. Then the unthinkable happened. The Undertaker grabbed Foley and flung his 300-pound body off the top of the cage. Time seemed to simultaneously stand still and rush by in the blink of an eye. Foley plummeted through the air and crashed violently through the announce table. The sickening sound of the impact sent a shockwave of genuine terror through the audience and the locker room. Backstage, the locker room erupted in panic. It was like witnessing a horrific automobile accident on live television. Everyone assumed Foley was dead. In a business built on controlled illusions, no one had ever attempted a stunt of this magnitude. Watching from home, Colette Foley was terrified. She tried to soothe their 2 young children by telling them it was all fake, but in the back of her mind, she was panicking. If The Undertaker had thrown him just a fraction of an inch too far or too short, Foley would have landed squarely on the concrete floor, or worse, directly into the front row of fans. Miraculously, Foley had visualized the fall on his head and managed to rotate his body in mid-air, landing as flat as possible on the desk to cushion the impact and save his own life. The Spanish commentator, Hugo Savinovic, barely managed to dive out of his chair before being flattened. Medical personnel, including Dr. Francois Petit, immediately rushed to ringside. Dr. Petit, a man with a background in martial arts and sports medicine, found Foley in bad shape. Foley had landed terribly on his back and had dislocated his shoulder. Emergency medical technicians brought a gurney to ringside, but it would not fit through the narrow walkway, forcing production crew to physically raise a massive steel cell just to extract Foley. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Foley was strapped to the stretcher. Everyone, from the fans to the announcers, assumed the match was over. But Mick Foley's mind operates differently. As he was being wheeled up the aisle, he realized that the longer he stayed on television, the more engaged the audience became. Despite the desperate pleas from officials and friends begging him to stop, Foley climbed off the stretcher, driven by adrenaline and an insane dedication to his craft. He turned around and began climbing back up to the roof of the cell. The crowd erupted into a mixture of awe and horror. No one could comprehend how a man whose body had just been broken could physically climb back up that structure. Backstage, the atmosphere shifted from concern to sheer disbelief. The next sequence in the match was supposed to be much safer. Foley and The Undertaker had planned a spot where The Undertaker would execute a choke slam on the roof, causing the mesh to gradually give way. allowing the Undertaker to stuff Foley down through the hole. That was the scripted visual. But reality had a much darker plan. When the Undertaker delivered the chokeslam, the chain link panels completely gave way. Foley plummeted directly through the roof, falling another 20 feet and crashing onto the solid wooden ring mat below. The ring mat is constructed with tightly stretched over steel beams. Hitting it from that height is virtually the same as hitting solid cement. To make matters infinitely worse, a heavy steel folding chair that had been resting on the roof fell for the hole right behind Foley, striking him violently directly in the face upon landing. The impact was catastrophic. Foley was legitimately knocked out cold for the first time in his professional career. Backstage, panic reached a fever pitch. Colette Foley was screaming at her television set, furiously trying to call the company, but unable to get through to anyone. She felt deeply betrayed, believing her husband had lied to her about the risks involved. In the ring, the situation was terrifying. Terry Funk and Dr. Petit rushed into the cage. The Undertaker stared down to the broken roof, instructing Funk to check if Foley was even still alive. Funk looked into Foley's eyes and saw absolute emptiness. There was nobody home. Foley had suffered a severe concussion, leading to a terrifying 42 seconds of complete unconsciousness. Recognizing the severity of the crisis, Terry Funk took matters into his own hands. In a brilliant piece of spontaneous improvisation, Funk provoked The Undertaker, taking a choke slam of his own just to buy the medical staff crucial seconds to tend to Foley. By all standard protocols, the match should have been stopped right then and there. But in that era of wrestling, matches were rarely completely stopped. Performers simply bought time. As the fog in Foley's brain slowly began to lift, his first thought was not his health, but of creating a memorable visual for the television cameras. He had suffered a massive wound underneath his lip, in a moment of grotesque brilliance. Foley shoved his own tongue to the open hole in his face and smiled at the camera. Furthermore, the steel chair had knocked one of his teeth completely out. Incredibly, because Foley was gasping so heavily for air, he had inhaled the dislodged tooth into his throat, which then traveled up into his nasal cavity, leaving a human tooth visibly protruding from his nose. It was a horrifying, unforgettable image. Despite his severe injuries, Foley insisted on finishing the match. He commanded the officials to fetch his signature bag of steel thumbtacks. Foley purposely rolled his broken body through thousands of sharp tacks, ensuring they stuck deep into his flesh to maximize the visual impact. Finally, after 17 minutes of unadulterated carnage, The Undertaker mercifully ended the match, pinning Foley to the mat. The Pittsburgh crowd of 16,000 fans was completely unglued. They had witnessed something completely unprecedented. When Foley refused a stretcher for the second time and walked out of the arena on his own 2 feet, the respect he commanded was absolute. The audience recognized the reality of his sacrifice. Foley understood that risking his actual well-being allowed the fans to thoroughly believe in him, forging an unbreakable bond. When Foley finally passed through the curtain to the backstage area, he was met by an emotional locker room. Vince McMahon approached him with a profound sense of gratitude and fear. McMahon thanked Foley for everything he had done for the company, but firmly demanded that he promise never to do anything like that ever again, all while medical staff were literally plucking thumbtacks out of Foley's skin. When Foley eventually called his wife hours later, she was furious, yelling that their children genuinely believed their father had died on live television. The trust she had placed in him to protect their family had been severely shaken. The physical toll of hell in a cell was staggering. Foley required 15 stitches just beneath his lip. He lost 2 teeth, suffered a severe concussion, endured a bruised kidney that plagued him for 6 weeks, and suffered dislocated joints in both his jaw and his shoulder. Yet, professionally, the match was a monumental triumph. It completely shifted the perception of Mick Foley from a bizarre mid-card attraction to a main event superstar. Just 6 months after Vince McMahon claimed he did not want to see Foley in a ring, Foley became the World Wrestling Federation champion. However, the psychological aftermath of setting such an incredibly high bar proved dangerous. Foley felt an overwhelming pressure to live up to his new reputation as a hardcore legend. He began taking greater and greater risks, believing he owed it to his opponents and the fans to constantly deliver something they had never seen before. Management repeatedly warned him that his reckless style would eventually catch up with him, but Foley firmly disagreed. Just 7 months later, Foley pushed his physical limits even further in a brutal I Quit match against rising superstar The Rock, against the advice of producers. Foley insisted that the match would not be stopped for excessive blood loss. During the climax of the bout, with Foley handcuffed and defenseless, The Rock began delivering unprotected strikes to Foley's head with a solid steel chair. The original plan called for 5 strikes, but Foley, swept up in emotional performance, commanded The Rock to keep going. Foley ended up taking 11 vicious, unprotected chair shots to the skull. Watching from the front row, Colette and her young children were traumatized. Foley's family wept openly as they watched him suffer genuine brain trauma for the sake of a television storyline. Years later, Noelle Foley confessed that she has blocked out almost all memories of her father wrestling, attributing it to the severe trauma of watching matches like the I Quit bout. The long-term consequences of Foley's choices are a looming shadow over his family. Taking high-impact bumps in a wrestling ring is scientifically compared to enduring a 25-mile-per-hour car crash on a nightly basis. Today, the medical community understands the devastating realities of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a degenerative brain disease caused by repetitive head trauma. Foley has faced significant cognitive issues, including periods where he would drive around and completely forget where he lived. After a WWE neurologist refused to clear him for competition, Foley sought outside medical opinions, only to be told by independent specialists that he should never step foot in a wrestling ring again. Despite the terrifying uncertainty of what his cognitive health will look like in 10 or 20 years, Foley continues to fight back against the darkness. He engages in spoken word tours, utilizing performances as mental gymnastics to keep his mind sharp and continue feeling the warmth of a live audience. Colette Foley encourages him to enjoy his life and his legacy, while gently reminding him not to push his luck any further. For a long time, Foley harbored a deep resentment toward Hell in a Cell. He fell into a dark emotional place, frustrated that despite a career filled with incredible storytelling and championship victories, he was solely remembered for taking 2 massive falls off a cage. He felt as though he had accomplished nothing else of value. But a conversation with The Undertaker changed his perspective. The Undertaker reminded him that what they created that night would outlive them both. Foley eventually embraced the match, recognizing it as the ultimate fulfillment of why he entered the wrestling business in the first place, to create awe-inspiring moments that fans would never forget. During a recent visit to the company's official warehouse, Foley and his daughter unexpectedly stumbled upon the original Hell in a Cell structure. Upon touching the rusted steel, the man who had shed literal buckets of blood in arenas around the world began to cry. It was a profound realization of his own mortality. He acknowledged how incredibly lucky he was to simply be alive. Looking back with the modern understanding of head injuries and brain trauma, Foley admits he cannot say with absolute certainty that he would have done things differently. The wrestling ring provided him with a canvas to create a form of surreal, sublime, and deeply painful performance art. It was a career filled with brutal bumps in the road. But for Mick Foley, on those special nights when the crowd roared their approval, it was the most powerful and magical feeling in the entire world. On June 28, 1998, the landscape of professional wrestling was forever altered. Inside the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, in front of a capacity crowd of 16,000 roaring fans, the World Wrestling Federation presented its King of the Ring pay-per-view event. At the heart of the card was a match that would etch itself into the darkest, most awe-inspiring corners of sports entertainment history: The Undertaker versus Mankind in Hell in a Cell. When you look back at the annals of professional wrestling, there are matches that define eras And then there are matches that defy human logic. Hell in a Cell hits you like a mallet to the consciousness. According to the accounts of the industry veterans who were there, the anticipation was thick, but the reality eclipsed even the most morbid expectations. The ring featured two generational talents who thrived on pushing the envelope. But on this particular night, the envelope was shoved violently over the edge. As the old industry adage goes, wrestling is predetermined, but you absolutely cannot fake gravity. What left the world stunned was the unrelenting, seemingly impossible punishment that Mick Foley, the man behind the Mankind mask, endured. Until you saw it with your own eyes, you simply would not believe that a human being could physically absorb this level of devastation and live to tell the tale. This match was real. The pain was real. The drama was real. It was a dangerously crazy masterpiece. But looking back through the lens of history, we must ask the haunting question, was it worth it? Act 1. The psychology of the hardcore legend. To truly understand the events of 1998, we have to examine the psychology of Mick Foley, according to those who know him best. Everyone who steps into a professional wrestling ring is searching for something missing in their own lives. For Foley, a childhood marked by relentless teasing birthed an overwhelming, almost desperate need to be liked. The documents suggest this trait manifested early. During his sophomore year of college, Foley staged a stunt where he consumed red food coloring and leapt off a bed onto a concrete floor just to spit up the fake blood concoction. When a female student recoiled in absolute disgust, Foley did not feel shame. He felt power. He realized that if he could not force people to love him, he could captivate them by disgusting them. He needed reactions, no matter the physical cost. This craving birthed a style that defied the traditional boundaries of the sport. A standard Mick Foley match was an exercise in brutality. Blood, thumbtacks, fire, barbed wire. As noted by his colleagues, he survived explosions from Composition 4 explosives in Japan, took spears through flaming tables, and regularly absorbed impacts directly onto concrete floors. His daughter, Noelle Foley, reflects that he genuinely thrived on eliciting visceral shock from the audience. Yet, behind the mangled flesh and the missing teeth, there was a profound understanding of sports psychology. Realism was Foley's greatest tool. By his own admission, he did not feel he had delivered a good performance unless he struggled to walk back to his hotel room. He did not necessarily enjoy the agony, but he relished his ability to absorb it and sell the narrative to the masses. As noted by his wife of over 35 years, Colette Foley, the man beneath the scars was a gentle, kind soul with a penchant for terrible humor. Their wedding song was even a theme from Beauty and the Beast. She understood his commitment better than anyone. When the adrenaline pumped, his singular drive was to ensure the fans went home talking about the spectacle, entirely at his own risk. Act 2, The Road to the Cell. Before the tragedy and triumph of Hell in a Cell, Foley had to carve a path through an industry that initially rejected him. He spent years obsessively studying Japanese death matches on a battered black and white television and a malfunctioning videocassette recorder, sometimes consuming up to 12 hours of footage a day. He absorbed a style where competitors battled not just each other, but the environment itself. His journey took him to Japan, where he sought to stand out as a foreigner willing to go to war with the legendary Terry Funk. Funk, a master of making audiences suspend their disbelief, became a mentor to Foley. Together, they engaged in explosive, fiery wars that cemented Foley's reputation for taking unparalleled risks. He was literally crawling on his hands and knees through the carnage, viewing it as proof that he was creating something special. At that time, the World Wrestling Federation was a general audience product, bland, polished, and largely sanitized. Foley's raw, violent style did not fit the corporate mold, according to talent relations executive Jim Ross. Company chairman Vince McMahon initially had zero interest in hiring Foley, viewing him as unmarketable and unattractive. However, Ross relentlessly advocated for him, arguing that the company desperately needed a chaotic antagonist for their top attraction, The Undertaker. McMahon eventually relented, but demanded that Foley's face be covered with a mask. Thus, the character of Mankind was born. According to Hall of Famer Gerald Briscoe, building a character from scratch was a monumental task, but Foley's unparalleled commitment made it work. He went off script, pulled his own hair out, and dragged the audience into his madness. As Jim Ross noted, Foley's willingness to try absolutely anything made him the perfect foil. But it also created a terrifying new challenge for management, keeping him from accidentally killing himself in the ring. Act 3, the pitch and climb. By the summer of 1998, The Undertaker and Mankind had laid a massive foundation, wrestling across the globe in 7 pay-per-view matches and 10 television main events. However, Foley felt the character had plateaued. He needed to do something monumental to elevate their legacy. The company planned to reignite the feud using a recently developed concept, a cage match with a roof known as Hell in a Cell. The inaugural cell match between Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker had set an astronomically high bar. Watching that previous bout, Foley was open-jawed, realizing he simply did not possess the athletic agility to replicate what those men had done. Seeking counsel, Foley turned to his mentor, Terry Funk. In a casual conversation, Funk jokingly suggested that Foley should start the match on the roof of the cage and get thrown off. What was intended as a dark joke became an obsession for Foley. He pitched the idea to Vince McMahon and The Undertaker. According to all accounts, The Undertaker was highly reluctant to throw a human being off a structure of that magnitude. Yet, Foley's legendary salesmanship prevailed, and the spot was tentatively agreed upon. Foley approached this match not as a grand second act of his career, but as a desperate bid for survival. He genuinely believed that when his run concluded, his career would be over. As the match approached, the tension backstage was palpable. Commentators Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler noted the immense pressure on Foley to outdo the previous cell match, despite lacking the nimbleness of his peers. Producer Gerald Briscoe and referee Jimmy Corderas sat at the monitor bays, acting as the pilots for a broadcast where no one truly knew what to anticipate. When the cameras rolled, Foley made his entrance and immediately began scaling the outside of the steel structure. The crowd was bewildered. Even Foley himself later admitted that despite assuring management he was comfortable with the stunt, he was completely terrified of heights once he reached the top. The Undertaker followed, and the match began nearly 20 feet in the air. Act 4, the first bullet dodged. As the two massive men, weighing a combined 600 pounds, moved across the roof, the chain-link mesh gave way under their boots, sinking dangerously by a foot. The zip ties holding the panels together began springing loose like shrapnel. The original plan called for Foley to suplex The Undertaker on the mesh, but The Undertaker wisely aborted the move, realizing the very real danger that they would both plunge through the weakened roof prematurely. Instead, they brawled toward the edge of the structure, directly above the broadcast positions. Jim Ross, watching from below, felt a creeping sense of dread. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. The Spanish announcer's desk looked like a miniature dollhouse from that height. Then, the unthinkable happened. A 300-pound human being was hurled into the abyss. Time seemed to dilate. Foley plummeted almost 20 feet, rotating his body in midair to ensure he landed as flat as possible on the wooden desk to cushion the fatal blow. The impact sounded like a horrific car collision. Broadcaster Hugo Savanovic had to hurl himself out of his chair just to avoid being crushed. Backstage, the locker room erupted in sheer panic. The consensus among the roster and production crew was that they had just watched a man die on live television. In the arena, an audible collective gasp of horror swept through the 16,000 fans. At home, Colette Foley scrambled to soothe her 2 young children, desperately assuring them that it was all fake, even as her own heart hammered with dread. Medical personnel, including the versatile Dr. Francois Petit, scrambled to the wreckage. Terry Funk was the first to reach the debris, checking to see if Foley was even conscious. A gurney was brought out. The match, by all logical metrics, was over. Act 5, the second fall and the limits of endurance. But the narrative of Mick Foley has never bowed to logic as they prepared to wheel him away. The audience watched in disbelief as the battered superstar slid off the gurney. With a dislocated shoulder and a body screaming in agony, Foley began to climb the structure once again. Backstage personnel were shouting at the monitors, begging him to stop. Fans were stunned by the sheer, psychotic resilience on display. By forcing the match to continue, Foley secured the emotional investment of everyone watching, transforming himself into an undeniable star in that exact moment. The script called for one final major spot on the roof, a choke slam that would ostensibly cause the mesh to safely and gradually give way. But professional wrestling is a live wire and precision is a myth. When The Undertaker delivered the maneuver, the panel did not slowly yield. It catastrophically failed. Foley plummeted through the roof like a stone, free-falling into the ring and crashing violently onto the unforgiving canvas, a surface that offers about as much give as solid cement. Compounding the absolute disaster, a heavy steel folding chair followed him through the breach, striking him squarely in the face upon landing. This was not planned. This was a catastrophic accident. For the first time in his career, Mick Foley was legitimately knocked unconscious. He lay completely motionless in the center of the ring. For 42 agonizing seconds, there was nobody home in Foley's eyes. The Undertaker stared down from the roof in sheer disbelief, instructing Terry Funk to check if Foley was still breathing. The chaos that ensued is a testament to the strange, improvisational nature of the business. Funk intentionally antagonized The Undertaker, taking physical punishment to buy the medical staff crucial seconds to tend to the lifeless Foley. In modern times, the match would have been immediately terminated. But in the late 90s, the show marched relentlessly onward. When Foley finally regained consciousness, his first instinct was not survival, but television production. Discovering a massive, bleeding gash beneath his lip, he purposefully forced his tongue to the wound to create a horrific, indelible visual for the cameras. As the fog cleared, another horrifying detail emerged. A dislodged tooth had been inhaled and pushed through his nasal passage, resting visibly inside his nostril. Despite suffering a severe concussion, a dislocated jaw, missing teeth, a dislocated shoulder, and what would later be diagnosed as a bruised kidney, Foley insisted on finishing the bout. He called for thumbtacks to be spread across the mat, purposely throwing his broken body into the steel pins because the adrenaline had completely hijacked his nervous system. Finally, after 17 agonizing minutes, The Undertaker secured a victory. Act 6, the slippery slope of the spotlight. The immediate aftermath was a complex web of gratitude and horror. Vince McMahon greeted Foley backstage with profound thanks, but delivered a stern mandate: never do anything like that again. Colette Foley, furious and terrified, berated him over the phone, explaining the trauma inflicted upon his family. Yet, the match worked. It changed the industry's perception of Foley entirely. Within 7 months, the man deemed unmarketable was the World Wrestling Federation champion. But success in this brutal theater comes with a terrifying caveat. The bar had been raised to an impossible height, and Foley felt a crushing obligation to continuously over-deliver. This dangerous compulsion led to the infamous "I Quit" match against The Rock just months later. Despite explicit warnings from management that his style would catch up with him, Foley orchestrated a sequence where his hands would be cuffed behind his back while he absorbed unprotected steel chair shots to the skull. The plan called for 5 strikes. In the heat of the unscripted violence, Foley absorbed 11 catastrophic blows to the head. The footage remains deeply disturbing, as his daughter Noelle profoundly observed. 11 blunt force head trauma strikes could easily kill an average person. The fact that a man was acquiring legitimate brain damage for a television storyline forced everyone, from the fans to the executives, to question where the ethical line was drawn. Foley's relentless pursuit of the audience's roar resulted in a grim medical reality. He suffered concussion after concussion, sometimes driving aimlessly, completely unable to remember where he lived. When a company neurologist refused to clear him for competition, Foley sought independent counsel, only to be told the same chilling truth: he should never wrestle again. Conclusion: the echoes of the cell. Today, the industry understands the devastating long-term effects of repetitive brain trauma, known as chronic traumatic encephalopathy. At the time, the impacts were likened to surviving multiple 25-mile-per-hour car crashes, yet the true neurological toll was a mystery. Foley's family lives with the daily, haunting anxiety of what his cognitive health will look like in 10 or 20 years. To combat the darkness, Foley engages in spoken-word tours, performing mental gymnastics to keep his mind sharp and continue feeling the warmth of the crowd that defined his existence. For years, Foley harbored deep resentment that Hell in a Cell was a singular defining moment of his legacy, feeling as though his diverse skills were overshadowed by one night of sheer insanity. However, a profound conversation with The Undertaker helped him find peace. The Undertaker reminded him that what they created that night in Pittsburgh would outlive them both. According to those closest to him, Foley was moved to tears when he recently encountered the original steel cell in a storage warehouse. It was a stark, terrifying reminder of his mortality, and a testament to the miraculous fact that he survived. In the final analysis, professional wrestling is a bizarre, deeply misunderstood art form. Men and women engage in fantasy combat, leaving their bodies in vastly inferior conditions to when they started, all to earn the acceptance of total strangers. The sacrifices are unfathomable. The risks are often unjustifiable. Yet, as the documents reveal, for a man who desperately wanted to be loved, the canvas of the wrestling ring provided an avenue to create surreal, sublime performance art. There were bumps in the road, some that nearly cost him his life, but when the narrative clicked, it provided one of the most powerful feelings in the human experience. Mick Foley survived Hell in a Cell. He paid an exorbitant price for his 15 minutes in the ultimate spotlight. The collateral damage was immense. But as the echoes of that fateful June night continue to reverberate through sports history, the question remains: when a man, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I have spent decades sitting ringside, calling the action, analyzing psychology, and witnessing the evolution of professional wrestling. From the raucous arenas of the World Wrestling Federation to the gritty rings of Extreme Championship Wrestling, I have seen athletes push the boundaries of human endurance. But there is one night, one specific match that stands alone. It is a match that hits your consciousness like a heavy mallet. A match that blurred the line between sports entertainment and sheer, unadulterated human survival. We are taking you back to June 28th, 1998. The World Wrestling Federation presents the King of the Ring pay-per-view. The main event of the evening features The Undertaker squaring off against Mankind in a structure known as Hell in a Cell. According to the testimonies of those who lived it, Hell in a Cell is a concept that strikes fear into the hearts of even the most hardened veterans. Going into that night, the wrestling world knew it was going to be chaotic. But no one, not the fans, not the executives, and certainly not the commentators, knew just how chaotic it would become. The squared circle featured two talents who possessed a notorious reputation for pushing the envelope until that envelope fell straight over the edge. Professional wrestling is often dismissed by critics as a staged exhibition. But as anyone in this industry will tell you, you cannot fake gravity. Throughout my career, I have been frightened by many things inside a wrestling ring. But nothing frightened me, or the millions watching around the globe, quite like the unrelenting punishment that Mick Foley endured on that summer night. Until you saw it with your own eyes, you simply would not believe that a human being could physically absorb that level of trauma and live to tell the tale. This match was real. The pain was real. The drama was profoundly, terrifyingly real. Behind the curtain and at the announcer desk, industry veterans were screaming, cursing, and questioning the sanity of the man known as Mankind. Why was he doing this? Today, the legacy of that infamous match persists as a towering, epic success, but equally as a dark, cautionary tale. According to backstage producers and medical personnel, the industry dodged several fatal bullets that day. When analyzing the spectacle, we have to examine the collateral damage. We have to ask the difficult questions. When does it stop? When is the spectacle enough? In this business, athletes pay for the rest of their lives for the decisions they make during their 15 minutes in the spotlight. It was a dangerously crazy masterpiece. But according to the man who lived it and the family who watched him suffer, we must ask ourselves, was it worth it? To understand the events of June 28th, 1998, we must first analyze the complex psychology of Mick Foley. Everyone who steps into a professional wrestling ring is searching for something missing in their own lives. For Mick Foley, the motivation was deeply rooted in his childhood. According to his own reflections, he was a young man who faced relentless teasing. This bred an overwhelming, almost desperate need to be liked by others, combined with a burning desire to capture the world championship. Foley often recalls a defining moment during his sophomore year in college. Seeking attention, he took a swig of red food coloring and executed a leaping dive off a bed, crashing onto a stuffed animal resting on a solid concrete floor. As he hit the ground, he spit out the crimson concoction. His dormitory peers stood there, watching in absolute shock. When a young woman yelled out that it was the most disgusting thing she had ever seen, Foley did not feel shame. Instead, he felt power. A profound realization washed over him. If he could not make people love him, perhaps he could command their attention by disgusting them. He needed reactions. He needed the world to look at him. That college student evolved into the hardcore legend. He became the man who survived hell in a cell. Many contemporary fans cite this specific match as their gateway into professional wrestling. They witnessed the carnage and assume this is a standard operating procedure for the industry, but it is not. Even by the extreme standards of a normal Mick Foley match, which routinely featured thumbtacks, barbed wire, and fire, this event was an anomaly. Throughout his career, Foley subjected his body to unimaginable horrors. According to historical records of his time in Japan, he survived arenas rigged with composition for explosives. He was speared through flaming tables. He absorbed agonizing falls directly onto unyielding concrete. His daughter, Noelle Foley, has spoken extensively about her father's career. She notes that he possessed a deep, almost addictive love for eliciting visceral reactions from crowd. He thrived on the audible gasps, the expressions of sheer horror, and the explosive cheers. For Foley, realism was his greatest psychological tool. He operated under a punishing personal philosophy. He did not believe he had delivered a good performance unless he struggled to walk back to his hotel room. It was not that he enjoyed the physical agony. Rather, he found joy in his unique ability to endure pain and sell the narrative to the audience in a way that was undeniably compelling. But behind the wild, reckless persona was a deeply contrasting reality. Colette Foley, his wife of over 35 years, fell in love with a gentle, kind-hearted man. She saw beyond the scars and the missing teeth. She fell in love with his terrible humor and corny jokes. Their wedding song was, fittingly, Beauty and the Beast. They were a unified team. She understood his unwavering commitment to his craft. She knew that when the adrenaline began pumping through his veins, his singular drive was to ensure the audience left the arena talking about the greatness of the show. Regardless of the personal risk he absorbed to make it happen. Before he was mankind, he developed an unpredictable persona known as Cactus Jack. Cactus Jack was a wild, untamed brawler. Watching him, you genuinely questioned his sanity. But beneath the madness, he possessed an undeniable charisma. You simply could not look away. He was entirely different from the polished, muscular stars of the era. According to Jim Cornette, a legendary producer and agent for the World Wrestling Federation during that period, Foley was a master of in-ring psychology. He intrinsically understood that audiences were captivated by performers who appeared entirely out of control. By presenting himself as someone who blatantly ignored the scripted boundaries, biting opponents and embracing chaos, Foley pulled the audience into his turbulent world. He commanded their attention, and his reputation expanded rapidly. To trace the roots of this extreme dedication, we must look at his early years as a married man. The Foley family bedroom consisted of a simple mattress resting on the floor, accompanied by a modest black and white television and a barely functioning videocassette recorder. Inside, that machine played endless loops of Japanese professional wrestling. Foley would sometimes study those tapes for 12 hours a single day. He was mesmerized by the realism and the gritty storytelling. He learned that a great match is not merely a contest between two men. It is a battle against the surrounding environment itself. At that time, Foley believed his ultimate destiny lay in Japan. The Japanese promoters were actively searching for a rugged foreigner to engage in a bitter rivalry with the legendary Terry Funk. Terry Funk is widely regarded by historians and peers as one of the greatest performers of all time, specifically for his uncanny ability to make audiences suspend their disbelief within a fraction of a second. Funk transitioned into a mentor figure for Foley. Together, they orchestrated incredibly violent, bloody, and explosive death matches across Japan. Foley found himself drawn to the wildest, most dangerous scenarios. He would literally crawl on his hands and knees, believing that extreme suffering was the ultimate proof that he was creating something truly special. Because of this brutal, unconventional style, Foley never envisioned himself performing for the World Wrestling Federation. During that era, the Federation produced a general audience product. It was highly sanitized, colorful, and heavily regulated. Foley's gritty, blood-soaked aesthetic simply did not align with the corporate vision. According to Al Snow, a former superstar and one of Foley's closest traveling companions, the chairman of the company, Vince McMahon, had zero interest in hiring Mick Foley. The executives believed he was unmarketable and lacked the traditional physical attractiveness required for television. It took the relentless advocacy of Jim Ross, the vice president of talent relations at the time, to convince McMahon to take a gamble. Ross argued that he saw a unique, raw potential in the eccentric brawler. Ross needed a fresh, unpredictable dancing partner for his premier attraction, The Undertaker. The Undertaker was, without question, one of the biggest stars in the history of the industry. For months, management had attempted to pair him against various massive, towering giants, but those matches repeatedly fell flat. The narrative was stale. Jim Ross recognized that The Undertaker did not need another slow-moving giant. He needed an absolute lunatic. Legend has it that Vince McMahon finally slammed his hand onto a conference table and agreed to hire Foley. But under one strict condition: they had to cover his face with a mask. McMahon insisted that the audience should not know his true identity, because in his eyes, Foley was a nobody. Gerald Briscoe, a Hall of Fame executive and producer, recalled the monumental challenge the creative team faced. They were tasked with building a compelling character out of a man the chairman fundamentally did not believe in. The result was the birth of Mankind, a deranged, tortured soul who dwelled in boiler rooms and pulled his own hair out in fits of agony. This bizarre, psychological experiment would have failed miserably with any other performer. But Mick Foley breathed life into the madness. He understood that without a genuine emotional connection to the audience, a character is meaningless. Foley was willing to try absolutely anything to succeed. Backstage personnel affectionately noted that he never turned down a challenge. He threw himself into the role with reckless abandon. For the producers, the new challenge was not getting him to perform. It was actively trying to prevent him from accidentally killing himself in the process. The strategy worked brilliantly. Mankind and The Undertaker laid a massive foundation, engaging in 7 major pay-per-view events and 10 television matches, touring the globe and captivating audiences. But as 1998 approached, Foley recognized that his character had plateaued. The shock value was fading. He knew with absolute certainty that he needed to execute something monumental. He needed an event that would dramatically elevate their shared legacy, rather than simply coasting on past successes. This brings us back to the King of the Ring pay-per-view. The creative producers decided to reignite the bitter feud utilizing a relatively new, incredibly imposing structure: Hell in a Cell. Traditionally, steel cage matches in the Federation ended when a competitor escaped over the top or through the door. But Hell in a Cell was fundamentally different. The cage featured a solid steel roof. 2 men enter, and only one walks out. The inaugural Hell in a Cell match had taken place months prior between The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels. To this day, analysts and peers consider it a technical masterpiece. When Foley watched that first encounter, his jaw dropped. He realized he did not possess the traditional athletic agility to replicate what Shawn Michaels had done. As the pressure mounted, Foley sought counsel from his mentor, Terry Funk. They brainstormed ways to make the upcoming match stand out. In passing, Funk chuckled and suggested a preposterous idea. What if they started the match on the very top of the roof, and Foley was thrown off? Funk meant it as a dark joke. But Foley stopped him, looked him dead in the eye, and stated with absolute conviction that he believed he could do it. The idea embedded itself in Foley's mind. He could not shake it. He casually pitched the concept of being thrown off the structure to both The Undertaker and Vince McMahon. It was a masterful act of persuasion. The Undertaker was highly skeptical and genuinely resistant to throwing his opponent off a steel cage, but Foley was dead set on the stunt. Eventually, he managed to convince the necessary parties to sign off on the spectacle. Interestingly, Foley did not view this match as a launch pad for a glorious second act in his career. In his mind, he was simply fighting to keep his head above water. He fully believed that once this specific creative run concluded, his career at the top level would be over. As the event drew near, Foley shared the broad strokes of his plan with his colleagues, assuring them he would be perfectly fine. The locker room trusted his judgment. They believed that if Foley could visualize a stunt, he could successfully execute it. On the evening of June 28th, inside the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, an electric crowd of 16,000 people vibrated with anticipation. The pressure on Foley was immense. He was walking down the aisle, fully aware that he had to somehow eclipse the legendary performance of Shawn Michaels, despite lacking Michaels' natural physical grace. Behind the scenes, the production area was a hive of nervous energy. Jimmy Corderas, a referee and ring crew member, watched intently from the monitor bank. Gerald Briscoe sat at the helm, producing the chaos. No one in the building, and no one sitting at home, could have possibly anticipated the sheer trauma they were about to witness. At the broadcast table, Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler were kept entirely in the dark regarding the specific choreography. Foley wanted to shock the world. He wanted to start a match in a manner that had never been attempted in the history of the sport. When Mankind's music hit, instead of entering the structure, he began scaling the outer wall of the cage. The audience was visibly stunned. The commentators were bewildered. As he reached the summit, the reality of the situation hit Foley. Despite his bravado during the pitch meetings, he was actually terrified of heights. The arena lights cast eerie shadows, and as The Undertaker's ominous entrance music echoed through the building, Foley secretly wondered how he could gracefully climb back down without permanently ruining his professional reputation. But the die was cast. The Undertaker scaled the structure to meet him. The match officially began 20 feet in the air. Immediately, a terrifying physical reality became apparent. The roof of the cell was secured with heavy plastic zip ties, but the combined weight of the two athletes exceeded 600 pounds. With every step they took, the steel mesh violently sagged by nearly a foot. The sound of the zip ties snapping and popping echoed through the arena like rapid gunfire. The structure was literally disintegrating beneath their boots. Foley attempted to execute a suplex on the unstable mesh, but the Undertaker swiftly countered the maneuver, acutely aware that the weakened roof might collapse entirely, sending them both plummeting to the ring below. The two heavyweights exchanged brutal punches, gradually inching toward the absolute edge of the roof, hovering directly above the Spanish announce desk. From a distance, Jim Ross observed the action, desperately hoping they would step back. The margin for error was terrifyingly small. Looking down from that altitude, the wooden table looked like a tiny, fragile piece of dollhouse furniture. Then, the unthinkable happened. In a moment that will forever remain etched in the annals of sports television, A 300-pound human being was forcefully flung from the edge of the towering cell. He soared through the air, plummeting almost 20 feet toward the concrete floor. Time seemingly slowed down, yet the impact occurred in the blink of an eye. The sound of the crash was deafening. It was a sickening explosive thud that mirrored the violence of a high-speed automobile collision. Hugo Savinovic, the Spanish broadcaster, barely managed to dive out of his chair before Foley obliterated the desk. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The audience erupted, followed by an audible, collective gasp of genuine horror. Backstage, the locker room exploded in pure panic. Veterans of industry stared at the monitors, completely convinced they had just witnessed a fatal tragedy. The man had stopped dead in his tracks. It is crucial to understand the sheer danger of that descent. If the Undertaker had thrown Foley a fraction too far, or a fraction too short, Foley would have missed the table entirely, crashing directly onto the unforgiving concrete or potentially crushing the fans seated in the front row. Miraculously, Foley had visualized the trajectory in his mind. Mid-air, he adjusted his massive frame, ensuring he landed flat upon the table to distribute the impact and cushion the devastating fall. At ringside, total chaos reigned. The unwritten rules of professional wrestling dictate that outsiders do not interfere with a match in progress, but human empathy overrides protocol. Terry Funk was the first to break the barrier, rushing to Foley's motionless body, desperately checking to see if he was conscious. Medical personnel scrambled. Dr. Francois Petit, the eccentric and highly skilled physician for the Federation, heard the panic calls over the radio. A martial arts expert and veteran bone specialist, Dr. Petit sprinted to the wreckage. He discovered Foley in agonizing condition. Foley had landed violently on his back, severely exacerbating a dislocated shoulder. Emergency medical technicians arrived with a gurney, but faced a logistical nightmare. The gurney could not fit through the narrow space between the ring and the cell. The production crew was forced to mechanically raise the massive steel structure while the Undertaker remained standing ominously on the roof. Foley was strapped to the board. The general consensus among the crew, the commentators, and the audience was that the match was unequivocally over. The officials were preparing to transport him directly to the local hospital. But as the gurney rolled up the entrance ramp, something shifted within Mick Foley. As the fog in his mind momentarily cleared, he realized that the longer he remained on camera, the more intensely the audience engaged with the drama. Despite the excruciating pain, an undeniable instinct took over. In an act of sheer unfathomable defiance, Foley rolled off the gurney. He pushed past the desperate pleas of the medical staff and the officials. They begged him to stop. They pleaded with him to go to the hospital. But Foley, driven by a terrifying commitment to his craft, began marching back toward the ring. The crowd erupted into an absolute frenzy. The commentators were speechless. Foley began to climb the cell for a second time. Even most seasoned veterans backstage were aghast. They questioned how a man whose body had just been subjected to a catastrophic trauma could physically pull himself up the steel mesh. Foley himself later admitted he had no logical idea how he would survive the rest of the night, but he had made a pledge to deliver a legendary performance, and he refused to break that promise. He reached the top, and the confrontation resumed. According to the original, carefully laid plans, the next sequence was supposed to be relatively safe. The Undertaker was slated to execute a choke slam, pushing Foley down onto the mesh. The visual effect was intended to show the roof gradually giving way, with the Undertaker violently stuffing Foley into the ring. But reality has a cruel way of rewriting scripts. When the Undertaker elevated Foley and drove him downward, the severely weakened zip ties completely gave out. The steel panel swung open like a trapdoor. Foley did not gradually sink into the mesh. Instead, he plummeted straight through the roof, dropping uncontrollably toward the ring below. If the first fall was a carefully calculated stunt, the second fall was a completely unscripted, unmitigated disaster. Foley crashed onto the ring mat. Professional wrestling rings are not soft trampolines. They are constructed of tight canvas over wooden boards and heavy steel beams. Hitting that mat from that height is akin to hitting solid cement. To make a horrific situation exponentially worse, a heavy steel folding chair that had been resting on the roof fell directly through the opening. As Foley lay paralyzed on the canvas, the solid steel chair plummeted down and struck him violently directly in the face. The silence in the arena was deafening. Backstage, the panic escalated to absolute terror. Colette Foley, watching from home with her 2 young children, screamed in horror. She had spent the evening trying to soothe her children by assuring them it was all pretend. But seeing her husband completely motionless, she felt deeply betrayed. She believed he had lied to her about the inherent dangers of performance. Inside the cage, it was the first time in his legendary career that Mick Foley had been legitimately knocked unconscious. The ring flooded with personnel. Dr. Petit, Terry Funk, and the referees surrounded the lifeless body. Looking down to the massive hole in the roof, the Undertaker visually checked on his opponent. The Undertaker instructed Terry Funk to verify if Foley was still breathing. For 42 terrifying seconds, Mick Foley remained entirely unresponsive. Terry Funk, recognizing the gravity of the crisis, desperately attempted to buy time for the medical team. In a brilliant piece of improvisational psychology, Funk attacked The Undertaker, intentionally drawing the focus of the cameras and the audience away from a medical emergency unfolding on the canvas. By all modern medical and athletic standards, the match should have been immediately terminated. But the culture of the industry during that era was profoundly different. Matches were rarely stopped. Performers bought time and found a way to the finish line. Slowly, the clouds in Foley's brain began to part. When he finally opened his eyes, the first thing he registered was the sight of Terry Funk's shoes. It was at that exact moment he remembered where he was. He was in the main event of a pay-per-view. Against all medical logic, he forced himself to stand up. His face was a gruesome mass of trauma. He had suffered a massive, gaping wound entirely through his lower lip. But even in a state of severe concussion and shock, Foley's mind defaulted to television production. Recognizing the severity of the laceration, he deliberately pushed his tongue through the bloody hole in his face, knowing it would create an unforgettable visual for the cameras. As the lens zoomed in, the world saw something even more bizarre. One of Foley's teeth had been completely dislodged by the falling chair. According to medical reports, he had inhaled so sharply during the impact that the tooth traveled up his throat and lodged itself visibly inside his nasal cavity. Despite the catastrophic injuries, Foley demanded to finish the match. He communicated to The Undertaker that it was time to introduce the thumbtacks. For the final sequence of this brutal theater, thousands of razor-sharp thumbtacks were scattered across the canvas. Foley, operating purely on adrenaline and a terrifying dedication to his art, repeatedly launched himself into the bed of tacks. He purposely rolled his body across the hazards to ensure maximum visual impact. When the human body is flooded with that much adrenaline, the performer no longer merely feels the pain. They become entirely consumed by it. Finally, after 17 minutes of unrelenting psychological and physical warfare, The Undertaker secured the victory. The aftermath was a scene of absolute exhaustion and awe. The 16,000 fans in Pittsburgh had witnessed something entirely unprecedented. When the medical team once again brought out the stretcher, Foley, defiant to the very end, waved it off. He refused to be carried out. The crowd responded with a thunderous, emotional roar. They recognized that the suffering they had witnessed was as real as a heart attack. Foley had purchased their eternal loyalty with his own blood and bone. Back in the locker room, the atmosphere was a heavy mix of relief and intense concern. Vince McMahon was one of the first people to greet Foley behind the curtain. The chairman looked at the battered warrior, expressed his profound gratitude for what Foley had sacrificed for the company, and sternly demanded a promise that Foley would never attempt anything of that magnitude ever again. As the medical team meticulously plucked hundreds of thumbtacks from his flesh, Foley turned to The Undertaker and groggily asked if they had remembered to perform the thumbtack spot. The concussion had completely wiped his short-term memory. The physical toll was staggering. Foley required 15 stitches to close the wound beneath his lip. He lost 2 front teeth. He suffered a severely dislocated jaw. He endured a bruised kidney that plagued him for 6 grueling weeks. He dislocated his shoulder. And he suffered a massive, undocumented concussion. When Foley finally called his wife hours later, the conversation was fraught with anger and terror. Colette screamed at him, informing him that his own children believed he had died on live television. From that night forward, the unwavering trust she held in his ability to protect himself was fundamentally shattered. Yet, professionally, Hell in a Cell was a monumental triumph. It completely altered the trajectory of Foley's career. The man Vince McMahon initially refused to hire without a mask became the undisputed world champion just 6 short months later. However, the psychological burden of that match proved to be a heavy cross to bear. Foley had inadvertently set an impossibly high standard. He felt an immense, suffocating pressure to constantly live up to his reputation as a hardcore legend. The bar had been raised so high that traditional wrestling no longer satisfied the audience's bloodlust. Management issued stern warnings. They explicitly told him that if he continued to push the boundaries of physical endurance, the consequences would eventually catch up with him. Foley understood their concerns, but he vehemently disagreed. Just 7 months after the horrors of the Cell, Foley pushed his physical limits yet again in a notoriously brutal I Quit match against The Rock. According to those involved, the match was designed to be intensely violent, but things spiraled dangerously out of control. Foley instructed The Rock to hit him with maximum force, holding nothing back. During the climax of the bout, Foley's hands were bound by steel handcuffs, rendering him completely defenseless. The original plan called for Foley to absorb a maximum of 5 unprotected chair shots to the skull. Instead, he endured 11 sickening, unmitigated strikes directly to his head. Watching from the front row, Colette and her young children were subjected to a nightmare. While the narrative of the match was fictional, the horrific brain damage Foley was sustaining was an absolute, terrifying reality. His daughter Noelle has stated that she possesses no distinct childhood memories of watching her father perform. Psychological experts might suggest this is a textbook trauma response, a young mind blocking out the horrific images of a parent being brutally beaten. She openly questions how those 11 unprotected shots permanently altered her father's neurological health. As the years progressed, the medical bills came due. Foley suffered concussion upon concussion. His peers recount heartbreaking stories of him driving around his own neighborhood, completely unable to remember where he lived. Eventually, a prominent neurologist independent of the wrestling organization delivered a stark, uncompromising verdict. The doctor looked Foley in the eye and explicitly told him that while he could shop around for a doctor willing to clear him, the medical reality was that he should absolutely never wrestle again. Today, the wrestling industry possesses a much deeper understanding of the devastating long-term effects of traumatic brain injuries. We now know that the physical impact of a standard professional wrestling bump is roughly equivalent to enduring a 25-mile-per-hour automobile collision. When you multiply that by a lifetime of extreme, hardcore matches, the results are deeply concerning. Foley's family lives in constant, daily fear of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a degenerative brain, disease linked to repeated head trauma. They openly admit they do not know what his cognitive condition will be in 10 or 20 years. Despite the looming medical fears, Mick Foley refuses to surrender to the darkness. He channels his relentless energy into expansive spoken word tours across the country, performing on stage, telling his incredible stories to captivate audiences, serves as vital mental gymnastics. The roar of the crowd, the lingering chants of his name, provide the essential stimulation that keeps his mind sharp and his spirit alive. For many years, Foley harbored a deep-seated resentment toward the Hell in a Cell match. He fell into a dark psychological space, feeling profoundly frustrated that despite a long, multifaceted career, he was exclusively remembered for a single night of spectacular violence. He felt as though his technical wrestling achievements had been entirely overshadowed by a stunt. But time brings perspective. During a quiet, reflective conversation with The Undertaker, his former rival offered a poignant observation. The Undertaker told him that the history they created that night inside the steel structure would outlive them both. That conversation sparked a vital shift in Foley's mindset. He finally embraced the magnitude of the moment. He realized that the primary reason he entered the grueling world of professional wrestling was to create unforgettable memories. Recently, Foley and his daughter visited the company's vast storage warehouse. Amidst the endless aisles of memorabilia, they stumbled upon the original rusted panels of the cell. As Foley reached out and touched the cold steel, the emotional dam broke. He began to weep. It was a profound, vulnerable moment. Looking at the metal that nearly claimed his life, he fully comprehended the sheer magnitude of his survival. When you analyze the incredible, terrifying legacy of Mick Foley, you are forced to grapple with the contradictions of his existence. He is a man who subjected his body to unspeakable horrors simply to earn the acceptance and adoration of total strangers. He desired authenticity. He craved love. Was the fame, the glory, and the legendary status worth the physical deterioration and the looming threat of neurological decline? According to medical professionals, there is no financial reward or championship belt large enough to justify that level of extreme risk. Foley himself admits that given what the medical community now knows about traumatic head injuries, he cannot state with absolute certainty that he would have made the same choices. Yet, he views his career not as a tragedy, but as a piece of surreal, sublime performance art. He utilized the squared circle as a blank canvas, painting a masterpiece with his own blood, sweat, and tears. He provided an audience with an experience that literally left them in awe. The story of Hell in a Cell is the story of a man who willingly walked through the fires of hell to cement his name in history. It is a testament to the unbelievable resilience of the human body, the dangerous allure of fame, and the complex, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying psychology of a true sporting legend. As we look back on that fateful night in 1998, we are reminded of the profound sacrifices these athletes make for our entertainment. The echoes of that crash through the announcer table will resonate through the halls of history forever. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of the most remarkable and harrowing chapters in sports entertainment. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a journey into the darkest, most compelling corners of professional wrestling history. Throughout my years analyzing the squared circle, from World Wrestling Entertainment to World Championship Wrestling, from Extreme Championship Wrestling to total nonstop action and all elite wrestling, I have witnessed the highest of highs and the most terrifying of lows. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compares to the events that unfolded on June 28th, 1998. On that summer night, at the World Wrestling Federation King of the Ring pay-per-view event, a match took place that would forever alter the landscape of the industry. It was a confrontation that earned its place as one of the most shocking spectacles in sports entertainment history. The Undertaker versus Mankind